Hello students, I am Dr. M. Bhushanam, Assistant Professor in Zoology, Maharani Science College for Women, Bengaluru. Hope you all are fine during this pandemic time. Take care of your good health. Well students, today we shall continue with the topic of isolation and isolating mechanisms of evolution. In this regard, we have learned the concept of geographical isolation in the previous session. And in today's session, we shall concentrate on the reproductive isolation, a kind of isolating mechanism. The objective of the study is to understand various isolating mechanisms involved in speciation process related to reproductive isolation. The contents includes role of isolation, the evolutionary force in speciation, and that the type of isolation called reproductive isolation. Isolation refers to separation or segregation of original population into smaller groups by certain mechanisms. If it is a physical barrier that acts as the causative factor for the isolation process, we call it as geographical isolation. Sometimes the separated groups in the same area, they fail to interbreed amongst themselves, or they don't show the process of mating. Organisms of species will remain in the same geographical area, but they never mate with each other. There are quite a number of reasons for this particular behavior, for avoiding the process of mating. And this type of mating process is called as, isolation process is called as reproductive isolation. So down in this slide, we find an original population getting divided into two groups of individuals, and these two groups do not mate. Otherwise, they are isolated and form entirely two different species. This is called reproductive isolation. Students, just a concept you remember, organisms remain together in the same geographical area, but they do not mate. So the mechanisms which are involved in the process of keeping them not mating or forbidding them from mating process is called as a reproductive isolation. Okay, the individuals of two populations living in the same area but do not mate are called as sympatric population. So they remain in the same geographical area and they won't mate. So such kind of organisms are called as sympatric population. So generally sympatric population do not mate in the process of reproductive isolation. So reason for this is, one of the reasons for this is geographical barriers again. Okay. So geographical isolation will lead to reproductive isolation. Stebbin, a scientist, explained the mechanism of segregation or isolation. And it was a zoologist by name Ernst Mayr who classified the reproductive isolation into number of types. But the broad classification of reproductive isolation is into two types, namely number one, pre-zygotic, and number two, zygotic reproductive isolation processes. Students, remember, pre-zygotic isolation mechanisms include before the process of fertilization or mating, and hence is also called as pre-mating isolation. So pre-zygotic or pre-mating isolation is one type. The second type is post-mating or zygotic reproductive isolation mechanisms. These are seen generally after the process of zygote formation or after the process of mating itself. Now, you'll have to carefully understand and make a note. Reproductive isolation is a type of isolation wherein the sympatric population living in the same geographical area do not get a chance to mate. They do not mate otherwise. We call it as reproductive isolation. This occurs by two means, two ways, in a broader sense. The first type we call it as pre-mating or pre-zygotic isolation. This happens before fertilization or copulation process. The second is post-mating or zygotic reproductive isolation mechanisms, which occurs after the process of mating. Generally, reproductive isolation of the type pre-mating mechanisms which is also called as pre-zygotic isolation mechanisms, which takes place before the actual zygote formation. Pre means before, zygote is the the cellular stage after the process of fertilization. So prior to the zygote formation, prior to the fertilization process, whatever the reproductive isolation mechanisms are there, they are called as pre-zygotic or pre-mating reproductive isolation mechanisms. It generally includes the process of copulation and the process of fertilization. This occurs in sympatric population or closely related population. Scientists have found that pre-zygotic isolation helps in the prevention of wastage of production of weaker or inviable or sterile offsprings as they experience physiological barriers during the fertilization process. What exactly it means? The isolation mechanisms of pre-zygotic type will help the nature to stop the wastage of the production of either gametes or zygote, which is said to be weaker, inviable, or it will not be strengthy, or it may die. It may become it may be demisable, or it may remain as a sterile individual. All these processes, it stops. It includes 6 types of reproductive mechanisms, isolation mechanisms, according to your syllabus. The first one is ecological reproductive isolation, or simply it is called ecological isolation. It is also called as environmental isolation or habitat isolation. Students, remember here the terms that we make use. For example, ecological, environmental, habitat. These are the factors that brings in isolation here according to the type. Okay. So here 2 different species of population belongs to the same genus. They live in the same geographical area but in 2 different habitats. So they share the common geographical area, but they live in 2 different habitat places. Habitat refers to the dwelling place or living place. So this habitat where they live, they show a different kind of environment, hence it is called environmental isolation. Or it shows a different kind of ecological conditions, hence we call it as ecological isolation. The habitats are different, but remember, they do not meet, but they are potential individuals. The place where they live is separated, but they live in the same place. Are you able to understand? Same area, but in different houses they live. They never get a chance to mate. So, but they are potentially mating individuals. They have the potency to mate, but they never mate. So, this difference in dwelling place or habitats includes difference in the food, difference in the space, different in the climatic conditions, etc. So, their living places, environmental climatic conditions or ecological conditions, it differs, it varies. Hence, this type of reproductive isolation is called as ecological isolation or environmental isolation. There are many examples for this type of ecological isolation. Few to cite are: number 1, Rana species of California. When we look at the slide here down, we have Rana draytoni, which is a red-legged frog. It breeds in larger ponds, so their area of dwelling place is pond. There is one more species of Rana called yellow-legged frog or Rana boylii. This breed, variety of yellow-legged frog, lives in streams. In the same area, one variety lives in a pond, the other variety lives in stream. So habitat is different. They never come together for the process of mating. So this kind of prevention of species of organisms from the reproduction by means of the habitat places is called as habitat isolation. Very good example for habitat isolation is these 2 frog varieties. Second example is spawning grounds of riverine fishes. Many fishes or fish varieties, during the process of breeding, they move to the banks of the rivers. When they move to the banks of the river for the process of mating, they do not mate because they will be selective for the species of their own. So spawning grounds will vary. Some will select marshy area, some will select the gravel area where the stony environment is more. Some will select the silty area where the soil content is more. Some will select the deeper waters, and some will select the marshy areas, like this. So different species will select different kind of environment for the spawning process. So they never undergo the process of mating prior to it. Example, variety number 3 is California salamander population. Here, down in the picture you can see two varieties. Totally they appear different, but lives in the same geographical area but in two different habitat conditions. So you can see the variety of salamanders of California. An example for reproductive isolation. Scientists have found that in salamander species, it is not only the habitat or environment that shows difference, but the DNA sequence within the body of these organisms also shows certain of changes, and they have found that it is due to mutation. So that these two groups of salamander remains as two different species, never undergo the process of mating. So that's the specialty related to this California salamander varieties. Example number 4 for habitat selection is, isolation is, two fish species of the family are sticklebacks, Gasterostidae varieties. One species lives all the year in freshwater, mainly in streams. The other species lives in sea during the winter. But in spring and summer seasons, these individuals of two species will migrate to river estuaries to reproduce. The members of two populations are reproductively isolated due to the adaptations to the distinct salt concentration of water what they select for their breeding process. So salt concentration varies between these two species for the breeding process. The next example is Turdus species. We commonly call it as blackbird. Turdus marula, it lives and breeds in the forest area, whereas ring ousel, Turdus torquatus, which is a related species, it lives and breeds in moors. Moors refers to a large uncultivated upland area. Some lives in forest, some lives in the open land area. So their breeding time is also different, breeding place is different. So they never undergo mating. An example of reproductive isolation related to habitat. The sixth example is Anopheles maculipennis group. It is believed that there are 6 species of Anopheles varieties. They all have originated from a single species. They all resemble same, but their habitat place, when we look at in the estuarine areas, some lives in fresh water, some lives in brackish water, some lives in marine water. Even their mating procedures will also be different ecologically. The 7th example is bluebird group. Mountain bluebird lives at high elevations, whereas eastern bluebird lives at low elevations. So mating doesn't take place. That's about the ecological isolation. Students of ecological isolation, whatever we have discussed or understood till now, You please remember at least 2 to 3 examples to answer in the exam. The next type of pre-mating reproductive isolation type is seasonal reproductive isolation, which is also called as temporal reproductive isolation or allochronic isolation. Here, two potential mates of different species do not mate due to the difference in their breeding seasons. Underline the term breeding seasons. So, the breeding seasons of the organism that lives in the geographical area will never have the same, so that the organisms do not have an opportunity to mate. Here comes the example of a plant called Tradescantia canaliculata. This species, Tradescantia is genus name, canaliculata is species name. Okay, so species of canaliculata will breed during the flowering process occurs during April to May, whereas Tradescantia subaspera, it breeds during May through July, May to July. You can see the two species of flowers. The left one is canaliculata and the right one is subaspera. The breeding seasons are totally different, so that they will never have the process of fusion of their gametes. The second example is Bufo americanus breeds. Bufo americanus breeds will breed during rainy season, that is May in USA. Whereas Bufo fowleri breeds, it will breed during rainy seasons of July. So they have two different, early rainy season is americanus and late rainy season is fowleri. Both are of the genus Bufo. So both lives in US, but their breeding seasons are different, so that they never show mating process. So it is reproductive isolation type of temporal or seasonal. The breeding season is different. The third example is Rana species of California, the same red-legged frog and yellow-legged frog. Rana drytoni, it breeds during the seasons from November to late April, whereas red-legged frog, Rana boyeli, breeds from late April to June. So they doesn't get the process of chance of mating at all. The fourth example is fruit fly in Hawaii Islands. Drosophila persimilis, it breeds early in the morning, whereas Drosophila pseudoobscura, it breeds during afternoon time. So two species of Drosophila, one is persimilis, the other one is pseudoobscura. Their breeding time is different, season is different, one in the morning, the other one in the afternoon. So they act as two different species, never get the chance of mating. The next pre-mating reproductive isolation process is ecological isolation, which is also called as sexual or behavioral isolation. It's a very important type of reproductive isolation which is frequently asked in the exam. In sexual mating, generally a male and a female individuals of a species gets involved, and these individuals will show an interesting behavior of courtship, a pleasing behavior before the actual process of mating or copulation. Courtship is a pleasing behavior exhibited by the organisms to please the opposite sex for the process of mating. So it's a prior mating phenomenon, courtship behavior is. Failure of courtship behavior results in the failure of successful mating process also. The courtship behavior, if it is having any deformities, the mating process will not be successful. Students, remember, the courtship behavior includes the call and response signals between a female and a male that involves in the actual mating process. It includes the mating dances, it includes songs of organisms, it includes grooming behavior or a pleasing behavior, etc. Down in the picture of the slide, when we look at, you can see how the birds are involved in this behavioral isolation process, actually involved in a courtship. Any change or smallest difference in the courtship pattern results in the process of inhibition of mating. Courtship is very specific to a specific organism, specific species of organism. Any smallest difference in this courtship behavior is seen, it stops the actual process of mating. It was Patterson who explained that these specific courtship rituals, if are perfect, it would stop the process of transmission of genes that causes infertile hybrids. So if courtship behavior is very perfect, then it will allow the genes which will bring in viable and more fertile hybrid. If there is any difference in the signals, if it happens, then it will stop the transmission of such genes so that it will form the inviable and infertile hybrids. So courtship behavior is very, very important, Patterson says. There are three types of signals used in ecological behavior of courtship by the organisms. Number one, visual stimulus. It includes dancing of birds of sex male, like peacocks, birds of paradise, etc. Then color display, feather display is unique to a species of birds again before the actual process of courtship. So down in the picture we can see how these organisms are exhibiting the courtship behavior by displaying their feathers. So it's a visual stimulus. It also includes the nesting material, nest shape, and the size of the nest formed by a male weaver bird in another example for courtship behavior. So pattern is very specific for a specific genus of organisms and species of organism. Second type of signal is auditory stimuli. It includes varieties of sounds, songs produced by a sex to attract its opposite sex. for the process of mating. It includes songs of birds like cuckoos, mynas, nightingales, parakeets, etc. Similarly, a song pattern is specific to a grasshopper species, Carthipus. So they produce a particular type of sound signals. We do find variety of auditory mating communication used by frogs, toads, the croaking sound exactly, and similar effect is seen even in monkeys and jackals, etc. The third type of signal pattern is the chemical stimulus. Majorly, it is by the production of sex hormones or pheromones, we otherwise call it as, which produces a specific type of odor or smell to attract the opposite sex for the process of mating. It includes the examples here is the musk deer or the scent deer, where different parts of this body of a musk deer produces a variety of the odor. Similarly, musting in elephants that attracts the females. So these are all the chemical stimuli related to the behavioral isolation. Female insects produce highly specific pheromones which can attract a male of 2 kilometers distance away in case of the lepidopteran insects like butterflies. So if a male is around 2 kilometers away, it can be attracted towards a female when a female produces pheromone. So that specificity is the sex pheromone in case of lepidopterans. Similarly, in Australia species, a corn borer, there occurs two isomers of pheromones, namely E and Z, produced by a female. It is attractive to the specific group of males. So it is emitted by a female, but it is attracted to only that particular species of Australia. So that's the importance of pheromones. The next type of pre-mating reproductive isolation is mechanical isolation. Students, even this type is important for the exam. Here, two different species of organisms show morphological and anatomical changes in their reproductive organs itself. But they look similar and they share the common geographical area. Or even sometimes it's a different geographical area. But here what you will have to remember is these organisms show anatomical changes with their reproductive structures. So difference in the structure of genitalia is the major reason for the mechanical isolation. So copulation do not allow their gametes or sperms for the process of fertilization here. Because even if mating occurs, the transfer of sperm doesn't take place because of the anomaly related to their reproductive structures. So change in genital organs will bring in this type of reproductive isolation. Example 1 is snail species. We have two types of coiling in snail. One is the right coiling, the other one is left coiling. Students, remember, both the types, left coiling and right coiling snails, do not mate. The reason is that their reproductive organs are entirely different. Similarly, of Drosophila persimilis and Pseudobscura. Their reproductive organs are also different. The next example is bucket archid and archid bee. The male archid bees obtain wax from the orchid variety. The bucket archid, we call it as. They use to make a substance to attract the female bees. So male bees will visit the bucket archid to get a substance, that a wax substance that is used to prepare the pheromone to attract the female. Here, the anatomy of bucket archid allows the pollination only by the species of this bucket archid bee. No other bees can visit there. If other bees undergoes the mating process, pollination process, the bucket archids will never allow. So pollination in archids, bucket archids are brought about by archid bees alone. So it's species specific. Similarly, the third example is lock and key mechanism in the genitalia of insects was given by a French entomologist, Leon Dufay. So he explains that the reproductive structures, namely the genitalia, related to Drosophila, Pseudobscura and persimilis, it is entirely different, so that the mating process is not allowed. Even if mating is allowed, the process of zygote formation will not take place. So that's the importance. The fourth example is damselflies, dragonfly varieties. Here, the shape of male reproductive organ will vary between the species of damselflies, so that the compatible female species will be allowed to mate, the incompatible ones are not given a chance for the mating at all. So it's a reproductive isolation. The next type of pre-zygotic reproductive isolation is physiological isolation. In this type, two different species of organisms do not show mating process due to difference in their physiological activities during the breeding process. So before mating, they should exhibit a certain of physiological processes, and those physiological processes are different between two different organisms, so that the mating will not take place. No successful mating. Here the copulation may occur, but the sperms will not be transferred. So transfer of sperms doesn't take place, but copulation is attempted. Why it is? It is due to physiological change in the body. Example is again the variety of Drosophila, Pseudobscura and persimilis, where the physiology of two different species, even if they cross, they cannot produce the offsprings because sperms are not transferred into the body of the opposite sex, that is female. The swelling of female's vagina, that is the mucous membrane of vagina, during the process of insemination of sperms into the body, this results in the obstruction of release of eggs and decrease in sperm motility. So there is a pain given to the opposite sex, that's a female organism, even though the sperms are released into the body. But those sperms will not reach the eggs for the process of fertilization. That is because physiology will change in the body of the organism. So, this is another example related to physiological isolation. The next type of premating reproductive isolation is gametic mortality and incompatibility. Students, remember, in this type, gametes do not fuse due to the chemical incompatibility between the sperms and the ova of two different species. So, mating occurs, sperms are transferred, but the two different species of are entirely shows the incompatibility with the gametic structures. We know that to ease the process of fertilization, there is requirement of chemical substances on the receptors present on the ova, which will attract the sperms for the process of fusion. So, specific species sperms will be allowed to fuse with that particular species ova or egg for the process of fertilization. But this does not take place because of that incompatibility between the chemicals present during fertilization between sperm and ova, so that the egg is not fertilized. So, the gametes of both male and female will go waste here. Students, remember here copulation takes place, transfer of sperm also takes place, but zygote is not formed. But why are we studying this under the concept of pre-zygotic pre-zygotic or pre-mating reproductive isolation type, whereas copulation is seen? So, this occurs, this example suits well for the organisms where the external fertilization is seen. Where the mating process is seen, their gametes are released into the external environment and later the fertilization process will take place. So, copulation is attempted, gametes are also released, but zygote does not be formed. So, it is predicted that the antigenic reactions in the genital tract of the female will prevent the viability of sperms that fuse with the ova, if at all it enters into internal fertilization process. If it is of external fertilization process, remember the sperm and ova never undergoes fusion because of chemical incompatibility. So, hence we call the condition here as what? Gametic mortality. Mortality refers to death. So, gametes will die before the process of fertilization. Example is sea urchin species. Many sea urchins that lives in gregarious group, mean to say in large groups, they discharge their gametes into the ocean. Sperms and eggs of all the species will enter in the water. But remember, species specific ova and sperms will undergo fusion for the process of zygote formation. Are you able to follow? So, here if there is incompatibility between sperms and the ova due to chemical distortions or receptor distortions, then the zygotes will not be formed. So, this occurs in case of the type of sea urchin, namely giant red sea urchin called Strongylocentrotus francicanus, and a purple sea urchin called Strongylocentrotus purpuratus. They both live in the same area of intertidal zone of western US, but they do not interbreed, mean to say they do not make their gametes to undergo fusion because their gametes do not recognize each other because they are species specific. So red and purple type of sea urchins show this variety of gametic mortality. The second example is Bufo fowleri and Bufo valliceps, where sperms cannot penetrate of one species into the egg membrane of the other species. It is because of the chemical incompatibility, so gametes will die. Similar process is seen related to the coral species of the given area. Then there is also gametic mortality is seen due to incompatibility between the male reproductive structures called pollen in case of plants and the style and stigma related to the female reproductive structures. So fertilization doesn't take place. You know why? To have that fertilization, the pollen grains have to show the growth of the pollen tube. The pollen tube formation will not be complete because of the chemical hindrances. So another example related to gametic mortality. So with that, we are completing pre-mating reproductive isolation mechanisms. Students, all are very important for your main exam. So keep practicing, keep watching the video, make a note of it again and again you watch, and record the examples, jot down the examples, okay? Well, the next type of reproductive isolation mechanism is post-mating mechanisms, which is also called as zygotic isolation mechanisms. In this type of isolation is seen after the zygote formation, but deformities or abnormalities related to zygote, embryo or hybrid or even the offsprings